Today, we're working on a new section, and our new section title is Modern Japan. So go ahead and write down Modern Japan and then underline. And for Modern Japan, we're going to talk about kind of how Japan looked after World War II and some of the economic successes that they were having after World War II. So we're going to talk about kind of how the United States was involved in the area after World War II, how Japan became kind of the economic success, and kind of how trade worked for them. So a little bit of review though first. So a little review first. Japan, as you kind of know, Japan is over here. It's part of the Ring of Fire. Ring of Fire just means it's on a tectonic plate. So it's pretty much on the edge of the tectonic plate. Tectonic plate moves. That causes tsunamis to hit Japan, as well as causing volcanic activity as well and such. So that's why it's kind of called the Ring of Fire. And we talked about before about how Meiji, the emperor, we talked about how he took over after Japan was forced to open up by Matthew Perry. That then led to Japan developing a whole bunch of technology, which then got them into wars with both Russia and China. They defeated both Russia and China for Korea and then for the Manchuria area. That eventually leads us into World War II, in which Japan kind of expands, takes over a large amount of territory before they're finally defeated by the United States, who uses 2 atomic bombs on Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Let's make a bullet and write down Japan after World War II. So bullet, Japan after World War II. So what does Japan look like after World War II? What kind of happens to the nation after they're defeated? Well, after Japan is defeated, what ends up happening is the United States comes in. We then occupy Japan. So we start, we have our troops kind of go into the nation and kind of occupy various parts of it. And we're kind of running a military government was kind of in charge of Japan. And we made some changes to the government. So we kind of made some changes to the government. And one of the changes we made to it, we made Japan into a constitutional monarchy. Going to make a 1 and write down constitutional monarchy. 1, constitutional monarchy. What's a constitutional monarchy? Constitutional monarchy is when you have rules for a government, constitution, rules for a government, and you have a monarch, a king or queen, or in this case, Japan had an emperor. So a constitutional monarchy is simply just rules for your king or queen. In this case, the emperor of Japan was kind of made more into a figurehead rather than the leader of the nation. So the Japanese emperor doesn't really have a lot of power nowadays. They're kind of just they're just kind of a figurehead of the nation without a whole bunch of power to really affect the government. And we also established a democratic government, which allows for elections. So they do have elections. So they have elections now, and they also have rules for the monarch as well. So they're a constitutional monarchy. So they have mainly the government's run by people that are voted in, but you also do have an emperor as well. Japan's military was pretty reduced after World War II. Let's go ahead and make it 2. Japan's military was greatly reduced. So Japan's not allowed to have an offensive military force. They're only allowed to have a self-defense force. And you'll hear Japan constantly call the military that they have as a self-defense force. So they usually don't refer to them as a military. They usually refer to people and their military as a self-defense force. So you hear that quite a lot in Japan, that they're a self-defense force. There's a couple other things to the government that Japan also made changes to as well. Changes they made to the government was allowing the freedom of press, so allowing newspapers kind of write about stuff, the freedom of assembly, also allowing women to vote was also allowed to after Japan lost World War II. This is General MacArthur meeting with Hirohito, the Emperor of Japan. So this is 2 of them meeting. MacArthur was in charge of the United States occupation of Japan and eventually, handing power fully back over to the Japanese. So economic successes. Let's go ahead and make a bullet. And we're going to write down economic success. So make a bullet and write down economic success. So bullet economic success. So Japan did have some pretty strong economic successes. They used to have a whole bunch of just families that would run everything. So they just had like these like large family-owned businesses and so forth that were kind of weakened. So what we did is that a lot of these like large families that owns like ton of land, we kind of broke up that land and then gave that to individuals. It's like, no, we got to break up your land. We got to divide up your land so that people can actually farm and make money instead of just one family running all this land and making all the money from it. We want money to get out to more people than just, one family. So we did some land reform to kind of divide up the land. I'm going to make it one, and one we're going to write down land reform. We're just going to write down land reform. So one land reform. And this kind of keep in mind, this means that we just broke up the land and so forth. So one land reform. Another thing we did as well is that we allowed Japanese workers to form unions. So that way they could actually form a union and they could actually defend their rights as workers. So we allowed that as well. Make it two, write down unions. So 2 unions. So 1 was land reform and 2 is unions. 2 is unions. So breaking up the land, allowing more people to farm so that more people are making money and the money's kind of spread out more, and allowing people to be in unions to kind of protect their jobs and push for the rights they should have as a worker. This right here are just the various businesses in Japan that are kind of car companies. All right. So these kinds of various things for the car companies and such. Japan is pretty good at exporting stuff. Things that they export send to other nations. They send like cars, cameras, TVs, and electronics to other nations. And they send out more things to other nations than what they bring in. So they have more exports, things they send out to other people, than what they bring in as imports. So exports is when you send things out. Imports are when you bring things in. And these are just some of their kind of car companies that they do have. This little cartoon right here is just about how Japan sends out more stuff than what it brings in. So it's just a pie chart and being like, hey, most of the pie chart is the stuff that Japan sends to other people and not the stuff that they bring in. And this again is just kind of talking about the same thing. Once again, it's a political cartoon. It's showing all the things that Japan sends out and then all the things Japan brings in. So it sends out a lot more stuff to other people than what it has to bring in. Although it is dependent upon trade to get various materials that they need, such as a lot of the raw materials like iron, steel, and so forth. They're pretty dependent upon other people mining those items and then sending it to Japan. One of the reasons why Japan was pretty successful at having a very strong economy after World War II is, one, they adapted to what the United States was doing, like our technologies that we had in industries, and using those. And they also had pretty well educated and a highly skilled workforce. Go ahead and make a 1 if you would. And after we make a 1, we're going to write down Japan has a well-educated and highly skilled workforce. So Japan does have a very well-educated workforce and they're very highly skilled. We talked about before about how 95% of all people that people that live in Japan, so 95% of all people that live in Japan have a high school degree. So 95% of all them have a high school degree. While in the United States, it's 85% of our population has a high school degree. So in Japan, they do have more people that have gone through high school, and they are a pretty skilled workforce and able to kind of get quite a bit of work done. So that was number 2. Sorry, that was number 1. That was number 1. So we already talked about how they have a strong work ethic. Also, Japan doesn't have very much of a military spending because, they don't really have much of a military. So they do have a low military spending. The United States, we have a very high military spending. We spend as much on our military as the next 10 strongest nations put together. So you're talking about like China, Britain, France, Germany, for example. Okay, so we spend more on our military than all those guys combined together. So we spend quite a bit. So we did talk about how Japan lacks natural resources and the way how they kind of get stuff that they need. So for oil, for example, Japan doesn't have any oil. So they do have to bring oil in from other nations so they can run stuff. So they are kind of a small nation with a lack of resources, but they're able to get resources through trade and through they're very dependent upon, of course, getting oil and iron. Okay, oil and iron they just don't have in Japan. So they're very dependent upon other nations sending them oil and iron. Well, not really sending them, but they do buy quite a bit of oil and iron. Where's all the oil? Well, this graphic right here shows you where all the oil is. You can see the Middle East has kind of the most amount. So you see kind of most amount of oils in the Middle East over here in this area. However, we did find out that in the United States, we actually do have a lot of oil. It's just the oil that we have is very hard to get to. So easy oil is over here to get to. In the United States, there's tons of rocks and so forth in array. It's quite difficult to get to all the oil that we have. It's expensive. Middle East, though, kind of sand. They're not too hard to get through. Tons of rocks and so forth to get through in the United States if we want to get to the oil that we have. And we do have quite a bit of oil in the United States. The United States is one of the biggest oil producers in the world. Saudi Arabia has kind of been number one for a while. But the United States, we're usually, depending on the year, usually number 2 or 3, sometimes number 1 even, in how much we produce in oil. It's just, again, the oil for us to get to is kind of difficult to get to. And this shows on the graphic who consumes a whole bunch of oil. You see in the United States, we consume 26% of all the oil on the planet that's produced in a year. Japan takes up the next amount at 7%, then China, then Germany, so forth and so on. So you can kind of see the graphic there about who kind of sucks up the most amount of oil in the world. Us, obviously, we take up a lot. Okay, well, that's it for our notes for today.